Chapter 7, Social Emotional Development in Middle Childhood. So let's look at the cognitive psychological process that develops during middle childhood that affects how kids start to react to the people around them and how they form relationships with their peers. And these are going to have implications for their social development and later in life. So it starts with, we really need to look at the foundation, which is still Piaget and decentering and the development of executive function. And so the foundation here, like I said before, is cognition and cognitive development. There's substantial development of the neocortex at this point. We're really getting close to adolescence when most of the cortex is developed. So that's going to allow for certain traits. So what we see here is development of the self-concept in relation to the social world around them. As a reminder, self-concept has components. Self-image, which is the what Cooley called the looking glass self, which is how a person sees themselves relative to how they believe other people see them. So it's the other reflected self-perception. And then there's self-efficacy, which is the level of self-confidence, and then the effect that self-efficacy and self-image have on self-esteem, which is the emotional sense of self and value from one extreme to another, negative to positive. Adolescent, kids in middle childhood begin to look around to see how their talents and strengths and abilities compare to the kids around them. So they socially compare for the first time and get some idea about how they fit in their cohort and how they fit in with the other kids. So those are the fundamentals in social emotional development. Now, what's really going to have an effect on the development of self-efficacy, the resulting self-esteem and self-image is the parental environment that they grow up in. In other words, what style of parenting are they subject to when they're young children? And the parenting style that endures as they get into adolescence when they become much less dependent and more autonomous, at least ideally. So what we have here is two domains that cross, two continua and affect continua. So one of them is the level of control from very high control to very low control. And the other continuum is an intersecting continuum from sort of warmth and attention, high warmth and attention to very low, sort of cool, dismissive, or distant parenting. And so within those two continua are four quadrants, and the high control quadrants include authoritative and authoritarian parents. So both authoritative and authoritarian parents are highly involved parents. So, and they have high standards, and so their level of parental control is high. Now they parent in very different ways, which we'll talk about in a minute. In low control quadrants, we have permissive parents and uninvolved parents. When you look at permissive parents, we're really looking at indulgent parents in one quadrant. And these are the ones that have poor boundaries and they tend to overindulge their kids. They're afraid of setting limits and disappointing their kids. And usually they're parents that find any distress in their child to be emotionally aversive. So they tend to cater to the will of the child to avoid feeling bad. Uninvolved parents also can be described as neglectful parents in some cases when it's extreme. Like extreme distant parenting is neglectful. And these are emotionally detached. Sometimes in extreme cases they have attachment disorders. They're inconsistent. They have virtually no boundaries because they're not really there emotionally or physically to set boundaries. And they don't have a lot of interaction. Now, there are environmental factors that affect what quadrant of parents are going to be in. So these things that don't operate, these styles of parenting don't operate in isolation. They're affected by the environment and what kind of demands are on the parents, their social class, what's going on in the world around them. So you can kind of think back to Bronfenbrenner a little bit and think of those outer circles where you've got culture, structures of society, or lack thereof, violence, other things like that, economic stress that can tax a parent with poor resources to unintentionally become an uninvolved parent just because there's so much demand outside of the child parental environment. So let's look at the psychological process that results when you have authoritative versus authoritarian and permissive versus uninvolved parents. And this is looking at parenting from a behavioral standpoint and looking at contingency-based parenting versus non-contingent parenting. Let's just think about what contingencies are. We talked about this before, but this is a behavioral concept. It really goes back to B.F. Skinner and Albert Bandura. So think of it this way. With contingency-based interaction, when one person is training or parenting or supervising or trying to influence somebody else, contingencies are the connections between that person's behavior and whatever consequences you render. So if that person has a sense temporally that the consequences are the result of their behavior, then that's a contingency. When there are no contingencies, the behavior becomes disconnected or separated from the consequences. And so in those cases, those are situations where a person may get a sense or perceive that what they do doesn't have anything to do with what happens to them, what the results are. Now, in extreme cases, that's called learned helplessness. That's actually an operant, where a person is in a hopeless situation to the point where they've disconnected from the contingencies and they feel as though their behavior has absolutely no relationship with the consequences. That's what Rotter called an external in terms of locus control. Extreme externals have very little sense that they can control what happens to them. Highly contingent environments where the parent makes it very clear that the child's behavior has an effect on the outcome, that puts them in the driver's seat of their own behavior. And they're likely to develop with a greater sense of efficacy and in a more contingent environment. So what you wind up with they're more likely to have an internal locus control according to Julian Rotter. So what that means is that any parenting that's contingency based is more likely to result in children that develop a high sense of efficacy. And that's going to lead to more likely a positive sense of self-value or self-esteem. So their confidence is high. And it's mainly because they make that contingent connection. Parents that parent in a low contingent way, disconnected from the contingencies, the kids tend to be socialized to learn that their behavior doesn't yield predictable outcomes. They're more likely to be describable as an external with regard to locus of control. They may have a real limited sense of self-efficacy, which leads to a low level of confidence, which can produce a negative kind of sense of self, which would be their self-esteem. So that's how the behavioral concept of contingencies versus no contingencies, how that describes this whole parenting styles process. So let's just look at parenting styles for a second and the contingencies. So authoritarian parents and permissive parents and rejecting neglectful parents are all non-contingent parents. So you have three kinds of non-contingent parents. Indulgent parents, where the child is rewarded independent of anything they do and rescued from any possible negative consequences. That's a kind of a parent that's running down to the school to save them from any kind of consequence there. They're given lots of non-contingent reward, which means they don't have to earn it in any way, or they don't have a sense that it's the result of their behavior. Neglectful parents are non-contingent just because they're absent. So it's kind of up to the kid to form conclusions about whether their behavior is going to lead to any certain outcomes or not. They may develop a sense of hopelessness about or disconnect between their behavior and outcomes. But they may not, because there's a hedge in here that kind of throws a wrench in the works in the predictability of it, and that is that's the concept of resilience. So a highly resilient kid is likely to be much less affected by non-contingent parents. So especially in the neglect situations, there are times when kids find their own way. They just have a predisposition to have a high level of resilience, so they can endure the neglect. Authoritative parents are the contingent parents. And so in authoritative parenting, the expectations are high. There's a lot of modeling of behavior, but not as much edict-driven or directive behavior by the parent as there are in authoritarian parents. Authoritarian parents are more likely to use arbitrary punishers. Most of their interaction is advice-giving. The power lies almost exclusively with the parent. So when the child does behave, they're behaving just to avoid a negative consequence with a parent or to win the parent over. And so they may develop a sense that they don't have a lot of control over what happens to them. With authoritative parents, they're more likely to engage in logical consequences. So like an authoritative parent is more likely to consider whether an adverse outcome is already a naturally occurring one. Like if a child misbehaves, or if they procrastinate, or they don't do what they're supposed to do, there may be a consequence that's already going to happen naturally. In that case, the parent will avoid hijacking that consequence by becoming the author of it or the dictator of it. Instead, they may just stand back and let the consequence happen, like getting a bad grade if you didn't study, or not having lunch if you forgot to take your lunch to school, or being late and a coach setting you on the bench because you were late. And so in that case, an authoritative parent will kind of do a logical evaluation. Well, let them suffer their own consequence. Also, they may step back a bit when the kids, if they're not in a harmful situation, when they're being, treated unkindly, and let them kind of work through that so that they don't get dependent on the world always having to be 100% fair. I've heard an authoritative parent, for example, with a child that was complaining about an unfair teacher, and the parent's response was, "Congratulations, you got your first unfair teacher. You're going to have more unfair teachers in your life, and you're going to have an unfair boss at some point or another, and unfair friends. So you can either have a meltdown about it and let it be a big problem for you, or you can learn how to strategically get past it. How do you get past somebody that's not fair, that has power over you? What do you do in that situation?" And it's a teaching moment. And so in that case, the parent becomes supportive when they push the child to take care of their own business as much as they possibly can, depending on how old they are and what their skills are and how dangerous the situation is. So that's kind of how the parenting styles work. So what we have here is, several kinds of sort of points that are made in understanding authoritative, authoritarian, neglectful, and permissive parenting. Another thing about looking at contingent versus non-contingent parenting, or authoritative versus sort of authoritarian or disconnected parents, is the use of intrinsic reinforcement. Logical contingency-based parents, the authoritative parents, are much more likely to use intrinsic reinforcers. That is, they won't over-reinforce so much or risk shifting their motives from intrinsic to extrinsic. So they're not going to pay for grades. They're not going to offer objective or monetary rewards when they can just offer intrinsic rewards. So things like compliments, affection, eye contact, humor, and activities as a reward for being a good kid or doing what you're supposed to do, being exceptional in some way instead of, lavishing. We tend to use too much hyperbole with kids these days. I hear a lot using extraordinary terms, calling everyone hero. And so when someone actually is a hero, we've got no word to use for them anymore. I've heard at schools, the teachers or the administrators may talk about how hard the kids worked when actually they had just completed a very simple task. So what do you do when they really do work hard, when they really are exceptional? It kind of takes away that goal. So over-rewarding is always risky, even in intrinsic reinforcement. Given too much, being too extreme in your feedback it sort of cuts off any ability to actually respond when someone is exceptional. Also, contingency-based parents, authoritative parents, tend to have just conversations with their kids, like goofing around, talking about things, more like engaging in interesting stories and things in the car, asking them questions. And as opposed to authoritarian parents who see themselves almost exclusively as renderers of consequence, rewarders, and advice givers. So they will see themselves as always needing to bring the conversation around to what you should do or what you shouldn't have done, or find in some way to critique something that a kid has said. First of all, that's aversive. So what happens in situations like that, one of the problems with authoritarian parenting is that the child gets punished emotionally for talking about stuff, for just bringing stuff up. And we're back to almost a basic behavioral view of parenting, and that is that if you want your kid to want to talk to you, then it's important to be thinking of how to make that conversation pleasant, to pair pleasant emotions with being around the parent, and to sort of intrinsically reward them subtly for them bringing up something. It may even be a problem they bring up or something they did wrong. The parent may choose at that point, okay, I'm not going to engage in a lot of advice giving and correcting, because they may, in talking about it, guide themselves into understanding what they did wrong. And then the parent can prompt by saying, God, what would you do if you had that to do over again? Because sometimes when I screw up, afterwards I'm like thinking about it, and then I think, God, I wish I could do that over again. What would you do if you could do that over again? That's a great prompt, because that gets them to self-examine completely risk-free, because they're not worried about the parent admonishing them or humiliating them or giving them advice that they're not really soliciting. The other thing we have to really look at in non-contingent parenting is the difference between indulgent parenting and neglectful parenting. And in an affluent society, which part of our society is pretty affluent, it's easy, well, even in middle income or lower middle incomes households, it's easy to be an indulgent parent. Now, some indulgent parents are not necessarily wealthy or over-rewarding. Some are. But sometimes indulgent parenting is fear of aversion, like rescuing them from any possible negative consequence or negative emotion, disappointment, and things like that. Because indulgent parents are sometimes just parents that are too sensitive and to their child's emotions, and they can wind up putting a blockade between their child's behavior and their situation and the environment and contingencies. In that way, a person doesn't learn how to deal with stress and the normal kinds of stressors and that everybody experiences. So they can actually be conditioned to become too hypersensitive to aversion. And that is a common thing in indulgent parenting. Over-rewarding is what we usually think of with indulgent parenting, and that's when there's just the rewards are just too much and too extreme, too extrinsic. And so the normal sort of motivators to accomplish are wiped out by non-contingent reward that's lavished on them. And we already talked about use of hyperbole and given extreme positive feedback for very minor accomplishments. Now, with neglectful parenting, part of the structure there is that the environment is so unstructured. Expectations aren't clear. Kids in neglectful households are required to kind of fend for themselves. And this is where biology steps in. When I worked for CPS, the Child Protective Services, early in my career, after I finished my master's degree, I went to work for Department of Human Services, Child Protective Services in Dallas. So I had a caseload of kids that were, abused, neglected, things like that. But I also had a bunch of kids that were in severe neglect or moderate to severe neglect. And those were in the shelters and things like that and troubled households. And this is where you would really see the ones that had a predisposition to be very resilient, and versus the ones that weren't very resilient. And so some kids were highly impacted by the neglect. Other kids kind of found their way. And so it's unfortunate when there's a disconnect between the child and the parent to the extent that they're neglected, because then you have to hope that they have enough resilience to get through it. But I've seen some remarkable kids that just could not be kept down. I mean, they just literally low-crawled their way through the neighborhood to survive. And often those kids you'd find and their siblings, you'd find that there was a core kind of humor running through them, a little bit kind of gallows or dark humor that runs through them, and how they describe their parents and their situation. And if you talk to people that were living in neglect or abusive environments as kids, when they reach early adulthood or later on, what's interesting is their conversations with their siblings will often get even more hilarious later on. Like, a lot of things that used to hurt them now are just calamities. And so there's a lot of moments where they're describing some calamity or some crazy thing that happened when they were a kid that's actually really sad, but it brings the humor out in them. And you can see in highly resilient people, they use humor to cope, because what they're doing is they're bathing their brain in dopamine and using it as a endogenous medication to do away with the depression and the anxiety that results in these cases. Another psychosocial variable here, environmental variable, is birth order. And I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench in the works in the birth order, because sometimes when you look at traits of first, middle, last born, there's a pretty wide range here and inconsistency. For example, you can't say that if you're a firstborn, you're going to be a natural leader, a high achiever, organized on time, a know-it-all, bossy, responsible, adult-pleasing, rule-obeyer, okay? And this is the problem in looking at birth order. Birth order is one of those things you ask the question when you're doing a psychosocial history. It doesn't have much predictive validity, but let's look at why. Because you've got to look at spacing. So in some households, children are very closely spaced. So the firstborn will be parented by the parents for a relatively brief period of time, maybe only a year or two before the before the secondborn is born. And then there may be another one a year or two after that. So what you might have is 3 kids that are all preschoolers. First, middle, and last born. Now in that case, the birth order may have a pretty dramatic effect on them because the firstborn is in very early childhood is being subjected to, they've got a different setting than happens when the middle one's born. And the first one, their status changes when the middle child's born. And then when the last one's born, their status is quite a bit different than the first one, as far as their hierarchy in the family, how much attention they get, the skills of the parents. They tend to get better as the as they go through. The first child, there's a lot of sometimes anxiety and kind of figuring it all out. The second child's much easier because it's much more predictable, and then the last child is sort of the one where the parents are sort of busy with the first and second, and so the last one, they're a lot easier going with the last one. They don't get as wrapped up in it. So, but what if the first child's born, and then it's 7 or 8, 9 years before the second one, and then in some cases another 5 or 6 years before the third one's born, or a first and second that are born pretty close together, and the last one's born like 13, 14, 15 years later. Kids reach their verbal awareness age at somewhere around 5 years old. That's when they start really being able to see the world verbally and are really starting to connect with the social environment, especially nowadays, because by the time they're 5 years old, they may have already been in preschool for a year or two. So they've already been socialized to some degree. In that case, though, when you have a gap between middle and last child or first and last child, they both actually may be raised a little bit more like a firstborn, okay? Because by the time the first child reaches, 13, 14 years old, and they're fairly autonomous as an adolescent, the younger child is born. So you have a nice, pretty substantial gap there. And then that last child's going to be, have the full attention of the parents because your firstborn's already fairly liberated. If they were 12 when the second child is born, which is not uncommon, they're going to be 17 years old, almost probably in their senior year in high school by the time that kid's 5 years old. So you have a whole different kind of social setup in the household because the firstborn is likely to become kind of a sibling parent. They don't actually interact with that younger child like a sibling, but much more like a parent. And then later on, an interesting transition happens. They begin to form more of a sibling-like relationship when that child gets older. But if they're born really close together, you have 3 kids in kid state and being parented by their parents, and none of them have much more of a authorities or caregiver kind of status than the others. So the further apart they are, the more you're going to have a different kind of dynamic between them. So that's why birth order by itself, you really need more than just birth order to really understand how that effect happens. You really need spacing. So let's look at effects of what happens in divorce and the effect it has on kids. If you just do a meta-analysis of all the literature that looks at effects of divorce on children, from a broad perspective, what you find is there are certain risk factors they fall into. So divorce just by itself puts kids in certain risk factors. Now, this doesn't guarantee they're going to be at risk for any of these things, but they are. If you look at kids of divorced households versus kids of non-divorced households, intact households, you do see that the divorced kids' households wind up with some of these risk factors, and that's delinquency, drug abuse, truancy, sexual abuse, and violence, victims of violence or child abuse. Now, the effects of divorce on kids is complex. So this is another, like birth order, this is another thing that has a lot of interacting variables in it. So the predictive validity is not that good, which means that if a kid is a product of a divorced parents that divorce, being able to predict how that's going to affect the kid is very difficult. You're just not going to be able to prognosticate because you've got several factors. One is their resilience. Two, the literature clearly shows that the better adjusted the parents are when they go through the divorce, the easier it's going to be on the child. Their social class, the economic status of the custodial parent after the divorce, and the effect that that economic status has on the child, and then what the parent does after they divorce, how they get into a relationship, blended families, and factors like that, all also affect all these risk factors: delinquency, drug abuse, truancy, victim of sexual abuse, or victim of violence. So those are all interacting variables. So if you have a financially stable parent, whoever the custodial parent is going to be after the divorce, and it's a pretty well-adjusted parent, and the parents are pretty well-adjusted, the child maintains, they've had a good relationship with their parents and they maintain a good relationship with both parents. There's good structure. The parents negotiate and get along well. There's no big fight over custody or things like that. And they establish the split and the second household. And then there's some consideration and logic in how they form new relationships after that in both parents. Then the chance that the child's going to fall into any of these risk categories drops pretty dramatically, down to pretty close to what it is in non-divorced households. And so when there's high parental conflict and you've got immature adjustment to the divorce in both parents, or either parent or both, when you have conflicts over child visitation, when you've got illogical, inconsiderate processes in forming new relationships afterwards, and unrealistic expectation whenever there's a blended family. That's when you're, two people that have been married before and they have kids, or they have visitation rights with their kids, and they get together and get married and they bring all the children into the household. Very complex, very difficult to do, and takes a lot of maturity and stability and objectivity to pull this off. So those are the factors that really affect, determine what the effects of divorce are going to be on kids. And then you also have to add in the ones that we were talking about before, and that's how resilient the kid is. The birth space between the kids and how they interact, like how much inter-sibling support they have. And that's why we're real slow to want to split up kids whenever there's a divorce. That actually adds some real separation trauma to the whole process. Now, there's not many things the legislature in Texas does right, because there's not a lot of thinking that goes on there. But one of the things that they really did right several years ago in the 80s was they formed the Texas Family Code. And the Texas Family Code helps make the divorcing process with custody and child considerations much smoother. And the design in the Texas Family Code was a little bit of the way California had done their family code, but most states now, if not all, have a family code. The family code is a separate set of statutes that deals with how people are married, how they marry, what is a marriage is in the family code, and then rules about child custody and when people do want to sever a relationship with children, there are specific rules in there about conservatorship, visitation, child support spelled out in the family code, so those, when they put that in there and created rules, statutes that you could fall back on if people don't agree, it really got the jury out of court in many of these cases. They're decided by the judge. You can have lawsuits that result in jury trials, but they wanted to reduce that because the impact on the family and the child and the finances in the family, it was just a situation where these long, drawn-out custody battles with jury trials and all that was really creating a lot of financial stress and consuming all the resources in the family and putting the kids in a really bad situation. So they wrote the family code. So just briefly, what happens is that the judge has a copy of the family code at the bench, and there's a complainant and a defendant, and the two sides of the litigants that come into court to get a divorce. So there's a petitioner and a person that answers, and the judge has a copy of the family code. If the two people don't agree, if they come into court with a petition for a divorce, and they agree on everything in the petition, and the judge reviews the petition to see if the best interest of the child is being considered. So the judge will try to let them set their own standards if they're getting along, and as far as their property division and all that stuff, and their agreement for visitation, and if the child support seems fair, then the judge will try to go along with that and let them set their own standards. Judges are slow to do that in some cases, like child support. They really, the way the law is written now, it almost punishes people if they don't go with the state standard. So, but the judge wants them, will let them present to the court their plan in a petition. If all agree and the judge agrees, they'll sign it, and they get a divorce decree and they move on. But what happens if they don't agree? So they fight over custody, they don't agree in child support, they don't agree with conservatorship, or they don't agree in the visitation process. Well, then the judge will order them to go to mediation. So in the family court is a specialty court that just deals with child custody issues and divorces. And so that judge will send them out to go to mediation. Now, when people are represented by an attorney going into family court, the attorney's going to know in advance that they're not in agreement, and will tell them we need to set up a mediation before we go to court, because the judge is not going to hear this divorce until you've been to mediation. So a mediator is a trained, usually ex-judge or family court attorney that does mediation, and they will get them together around a table and try to work it all out, realizing that the family code is the standard. So the attorneys will try to get them as close to the family code as possible, the standards in the family code, so there's no dispute in court between the judge and the parents. I've been a consultant in family court in divorce cases over visitations and conservatorship, and I've seen cases where the deal was so bad for the child, even though the parents completely agreed, the deal was so bad for the child that I objected and said that this was not in the child's best interest. And this was, one case, for example, was toddlers. The parents were getting a divorce, and they were perfectly happy to have the kids changing households monthly. And so they had agreed that the two kids would go to one house for a month, and then they'd go to the other house for a month, and each one would maintain, rooms for them and all that stuff. And these kids were getting close to preschool. The problem is they were going to be in they were going to be in contiguous counties, but they were going to be in two different school districts. And so, when we went to court, it was the question I had for the court was, how would you like to move every month? And that's just too chaotic. And I explained to the court that the kid's sense of time is much slower than adults. A month in a place is a very long time to a child, and then having to adjust to a month in another place would be awfully chaotic. So the judge said no on the agreement. Had some really angry parents, but it just wasn't in the child's best interest. The other thing that the court will do to maintain, to look out for the child's best interest is to assign a attorney ad litem to the children. So in a custody battle, the judge will order an attorney ad litem for the kids. So the kids get their own lawyer. And the attorney ad litem's job is to look at what's going on in the divorce petition between the two parties and make sure that the kid's interest is being considered in that. They'll also look at resources and child support and things like that to make sure that the children's interests are protected. So ad litems have a lot of power in the court. I will say this, though, is it's not a perfect world. When kids and their needs go up against adults, they don't always win. So you do have cases where the agreement that gets worked out with the adults just isn't that good for the kids. But usually what judges will do is, if the parents don't agree and mediation isn't working and they're fighting with each other and it's just a bad situation, the judge will pull out the family code and just say, here's your visitation, standard visits, assign one of them as primary conservatorship and the other as the visiting parent, and then set the child support based on the chart. You know, they'll in discovery they'll get the people's tax returns and their check stubs, find out what they make and all that, and whoever the non-custodial parent is, they'll just set the child support. And now in the state of Texas, you have to pay child support through the State Attorney General's office. So they set up the child support enforcement case, and all child support goes through there. They log it in on a spreadsheet, and that's a legal record of that person paying child support. So they've done these things to try to get the conflicts out. And having been in that system quite a bit, and as an expert witness, I can tell you that it is a much better way to go than watch people having an all-out, shooting war right there. Not literally, but a big war in court, because that really does a lot of damage to the kids. Let's look at child maltreatment. So physical abuse, kind of misunderstood actually. These are the definitions we had at CPS, or statutory definitions. CPS is Child Protective Services. It's operated under the Department of Human Services, and every county has a most counties have a CPS office. And so CPS is where child abuse gets reported. Child abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse gets reported to Child Protective Services. There is a mandate, a reporting mandate in the law. It's a criminal offense to be aware that a child's being abused and not report it. And that includes family members, friends, neighbors, somebody that just casually sees it on the street, or medical personnel, providers, physicians, nurses, teachers. They're all required to report. So if you're aware of child support and you don't report it, you can be criminally liable. The person can actually bind up prosecuted for that. So child abuse is defined as any treatment of a child that results in any physical sign of abuse. This is physical abuse. So bruising, abrasions, whelps, red spots, a slap mark on their face, a chipped tooth, all the way up to fractured skulls and bones and subdural hematomas, and all this stuff that I've seen in cases when I was at CPS. Now, a lot of parents, their defense, and I've even had some attorneys try to put this up as a defense in child abuse cases, would say, well, that kid's real easy to bruise. Well, and as the way the law works is if they're easy to bruise, you just can't hit them that hard. So you can't spank a kid that will be bruised by a spanking, or they'll have whelps on them from a spanking. It's against the law. So if you can see the result of the physical punishment, then that is in the law child abuse. That's an assault on a child. Now, at CPS, we wound up with cases where they, whipping with a belt or a switch or something like that would result in marks or bruises on the kid's back or bottom, usually discovered by a teacher or a coach or somebody like that, and reported to CPS. And then, or sometimes, a kid gets taken to the emergency room because they, for an ear infection or something like that, and in the process of examining the kid, they notice that they have bruises or abrasions, so they would call CPS, and then we'd go out to the hospital and, interview the parents and open a case. So, but sometimes they would try to use the defense, that they're easy to bruise or whatever. And so we would open a case. Now, the goal in CPS was to return the child to the home. You're not, or to set things up so they can stay home, because last thing you want to do is remove a child from their home. And in many of these families, they're fixable. So most of them, they're fixable. I'll point something else. This isn't a test question or anything, but it's important. The one thing I learned from being at CPS, I was there for 3 years as a caseworker, which is a long time in CPS. But one thing I learned being at CPS is there are really 2 categories of abusers. And one of them is really common, and that's the reactive abusers. That's my term. A reactive abuser is a person that's overwhelmed by a lot of things. They have some anger control problems. They're stressed out. They may not be in the best of health, and they might be actually paired with a kid that's pretty difficult to deal with as well, prone to, fits and aggression, and maybe, they have Asperger's, mild autism or something like that, and they're not an easy kid. And so sometimes you can get a low-skilled parent or a stressed-out parent paired with a difficult kid, and that's where you're most likely to have abuse cases. But reactive abusers don't intend to put that whelp, that abrasion, or that bruise on that kid. It's just in the process of losing control with them and having difficulty with them and fighting with them, the kid winds up getting bruised up or get abrasions or things like that. So reactive abusers, the type of injuries they have, in the most severe ones, they can have skull fractures and bleeds in the brain and shaken baby, which is when you have a spinal contusion or trauma in the brainstem or the cervical neck after the kid's been shaken real hard or in a whipping action sometimes, usually in infants or kids before they have developed reflex, muscular reflex that protects their neck. You can have spiraling fractures in their arms, and that's when, usually in toddlers, when somebody will grab a toddler and pull them up by their arm and twist their arm, and in the process they can wind up running a spiraling fracture around the humerus or one of the bones. And a spiraling fracture can only happen one way. You have to twist the arm. That's the only way you can get a spiraling fracture. So I've been in the emergency room, and the doc can put up there on the x-ray of their arm, and sure enough, you'd have a fracture going around the arm. And so that's a case right there. But the thing about reactive abusers is they're most of the time, your strategy when you're CPS is to try to fix the parents, fix the home so you can keep the kid in the home, because these parents, sometimes they're awful parents. But in the more moderate to mild cases of reactive abuse, they may actually not be just super bad people or bad parents. It's not a characterological disorder. It's an emotional disorder. So the first thing that would happen is you get a court order, a protective order, that they cannot spank the child. So if they're going to have any contact with the child during their visits, or if you're going to keep the child in the home, and then they're going to be prohibited from using physical punishment, because they've lost that right temporarily because they abused the child. There's a whole different world with sadistic abusers or characterological abusers. That's my word as well. Sadistic and characterological abusers are the ones that are doing the cigarette burning and the boiling water and all the god-awful stuff that you hear about in the news. It's rare. Those cases are rare. That's why they're in the news when they happen. The injuries can be anything from superficial, like a small burn or a scratch or something like that that's been put there intentionally, to really, really severe cases where there's scaldings and really and severe cases. The thing I learned from being in the process with sadistic or characterological abusers is they usually have a whole variety of psychopathologies, and it's just too dangerous for the kids to be there. And so those are the ones where you're more likely to have long-term separation and placement with a family member, or in the more serious cases, you can put them up in therapeutic foster care. And in the worst cases, we'd actually seek termination of their parental rights. When you didn't have a reliable family member you could put them with, and they were in foster care for too long, we would look at terminating the parental rights because the person's just way too dangerous. Also, that kind of behavior does not exist by itself. If they're doing that to their own child, you can imagine they're also have all kinds of other criminality and problems, and sometimes drug abuse and things like that. So the home is inherently just very, very dangerous. In sexual abuse cases, there's also sort of categories of sexual abuse: reactive abusers and pedophiles. In those cases, though, if you look at the literature on sexual abuse, what you find is that there's no real therapeutic process that guarantees that a person that sexually abuses children is ever going to be safe around children. And that's a dilemma that you run into when you have parents that are abusing their own child. Is at what point can you say, well, this is a safe person to be around kids, or a teacher that sexually abuses a child, or a caregiver that sexually abuses a child? At what point can you feel confident that some therapy or counseling or something will make them safe around kids? And the answer to that is it's very difficult to have any kind of psychotherapy that guarantees that they're going to be safe around kids thereafter, because people that sexually abuse children are the world's worst recidivists. And no prison term makes a difference. They don't get better after they're age 32, which every other criminal category does. Violent offenders get much less violent after they're about 30 years, after they get through age 30 transition. Not with sexual abuse. They'll still be prone to molesting children, especially the pedophiles, until late life. So that gets to be a real issue. And that's controversial, I realize, because I've had people that do therapy with people that have been arrested for sexual abuse, and they take issue with my stand on that. But I've worked in a sexual abuse unit and have gone over the literature in sexual abuse. I never wanted to really, after CPS, I didn't really want to work in the sexual abuse world, just because it's a very difficult thing to deal with. And then there's emotional abuse and failure to provide access to education. And in my opinion, we're kind of seeing failure to provide access to education a lot more now than we did when mandatory education was still in effect, and there weren't all the bailouts that we have now. But emotional abuse and psychosocial and neglect are other problems that you see that are CPS cases under maltreatment. But what's interesting is, if you look at the literature on the effects of maltreatment, neglect is the one that is the most predictable in formulating problems in later life. Even physical abuse and sexual abuse has to get really severe before it's as predictable in lifelong effects as neglect is. And now, those aren't mutually exclusive. Many times when a child's being physically abused or sexually abused or emotionally abused, they're also being neglected. Their basic needs are being neglected. But not always. Sometimes you can have kids that are not physically abused, not sexually abused, but they are neglected. And so neglect tends to have more predictable long-term effects. But neglect is also something that it's the hardest to do anything about, because a person has a right to be a really bad parent. And until that child is in danger, there isn't really much you can do legally. So the dirty kid that's not getting really very good nutrition and no guidance, and the house is awful, until it's just dangerous to the child's health, there really isn't much you can do about it. And I had cases at CPS where I knew that kid was in big trouble because of their neglect that was in the home, and just how dismissive and awful the resources were in the home, and the skill of the parents. But it didn't rise to the level where I could get a judge to do anything about it. So I didn't have any authority. I'd have to close the case, give them a bunch of resources and close the case, knowing that that kid's probably in bigger trouble than another case I'd have where they weren't being neglected, but they were being physically or sexually abused. In those cases, they were always priority one cases. So that's kind of how that works in the child maltreatment world on the legal side. Another thing that determines how well the child's going to do when they're being maltreated, the literature shows pretty clearly that the better their support system, supportive relatives, supportive friends, supportive neighbors, or an attentive teacher, or a school counselor, anything like that can make a huge difference. Clergy, Sunday school teachers, those are people often that will intervene with a kid and give them emotional support when they're going through problems with their family and things like that. So you can see that neglected kids often get saved by people at church, people at school, people in the neighborhood. They get saved by them. I saw that when I worked at the shelter. And these are just kind of the angels in our community that come to their rescue. Just another consideration here, and this has to do with latchkey kids and maladaptive responses to their abuse. That is, kids that struggle with their abuse. They're at risk for abuse of alcohol, anger control problems. They may pair themselves up with toxic peer groups. And one of the myths is that peer influences cause kids to have bad behavior or be maladaptive. The truth is that kids that already have a predisposition to have problems and maladaptive behaviors seek out like-minded peers. So a peer group's not going to influence a high-functioning, well-adjusted kid to become a heroin addict. I mean, I've heard people say that, but that's kind of the thing that, some defensive parents will say, well, if they hadn't gotten in with all those bad kids, well, we kind of seek out the kids that are like us, So consistency, going to school, truancy, running away, and homelessness. Teenage pregnancy is much higher risk in kids that are abused or neglected, and getting involved in delinquency and crime. It's shocking how many, with drug abuse and alcohol, a lot of times you'll have a laissez-faire parent that actually gives their kids alcohol. I can't tell you how many cases I had where in the family therapy world where I'd have parents actually say, well, I'd rather they drink here than drink, if you tell them no, they can't have alcohol when they're 16 years old, they're going to try it anyway, so they might as well drink at home. Well, that caused some researchers to actually look at that problem, and they found this. If a child's given alcohol before age, a person's given alcohol by their parents before age 21, they're significantly more likely to develop serious alcohol problems later on. And you can regress that on the age of earliest introduction to alcohol. So even sips of wine and beer in young kids raises their risk that they'll develop a problem with alcohol later on, as well as other drugs if they, if they're introduced to that, like giving them puffs off a cigarette, significantly increases the probability they're going to become smokers later on. I had a case of CPS with a couple of cases where parents got their kids stoned on pot because it helped them sleep. or they were giving their kids Benadryl or alcohol to get them to sleep when they were toddlers because they were, having difficulty getting them to sleep. That's all ill-advised. It's a terrible idea. Giving antihistamines to help kids sleep is a terrible idea. And even I've heard some medical people even recommend that. It's an awful idea. Teen pregnancy is a problem because it's when teenagers who aren't really equipped to make certain decisions for themselves, 13, 14-year-olds, are in an environment where there's very little structure and what you'd call psychosocial neglect cases, it's almost universal. Those kids are going to wind up in sexual relationships before they're really prepared to manage a sexual relationship, and that's why pregnancy winds up being a problem. Also, doing away with services, community-based services for females where they can go, even as a teenager, and anonymously get birth control from an agency like Planned Parenthood, raises the probability significantly that those kids are going to wind up pregnant, because Planned Parenthood may be the only place they can walk into and get services anonymously without having to have any kind of parental permission, because they don't have permission to have sex, and they, as well may not have permission to get birth control. So doing away with services for young women can be a real problem in raising the risk for pregnancy. So where does prejudice come from? This is a big topic now because we're talking about racial attitudes, racial prejudice, and discrimination. And so when we look at racial prejudice, the first thing we need to look at is me, not me kind of prejudice. And that's the natural prejudice. That's the ownership of familiarity. Like, I like people that are like me, or I don't like people that aren't like me. So now, some people, the definition of what's like me, what's not like me, is determined by how much diversity there's, with regard to race, is determined by how much diversity there's been in that person's environment as far as racial diversity. And so when kids are exposed to a diverse population growing up, one of the things that happens is repeated exposure and familiarity. And that is that when they're around people that have different ethnic backgrounds than they do, and the kids that speak different languages or dialects, they look different. When they're around a variety of kids that, when they're young, very young, when they're around a variety of kids, what happens is they don't form the distinctions. The things that they think are like me, not like me, may not actually have much to do with race or dialect or social ethnic variables. So a kid can see someone that's of a different racial group as like me because they've hung around with them enough and traded ideas enough, and they may even speak the, trade dialects, like use words and things that are common for their community. If it's a diverse community, then there's going to be kind of it's all going to be a mixed dialect. They're going to be using each other's words and dialects. The other thing that determines prejudice is what's modeled for kids. Kids observe and imitate. That's how they socialize. That's Albert Bandura's theory in how we socialize. So they pick up pretty subtle cues from television, parents, adults around them, other kids, as to how to react to people based on how they look or what their ethnic group is. They may see, there may be something as generalizable as, where do you tend to see people that look like this? Like years ago, and now even, when we see communities that are highly segregated by social class and race, what happens is that, kids grow up in an environment and they may see well, when people are from this certain ethnic group, Hispanic or African American or something like that, they tend to be in poor neighborhoods. And so they over associate lower income with blacks and Hispanics. So they may form the sort of stereotype that, well, if you're black or Hispanic, then you're from a lower income neighborhood. And that's because their little brain is forming those associations just from their experience. And those are usually kids that are in predominantly white exurbs, and they just don't have much diversity in their peer group, in their social group. We had a period of desegregation that went from the start of busing in about the early 70s all the way through when the exurbs started developing. But then we got white flight with the development of the exurbs, and we've seen some re-establishment of segregation in the way cities and the suburbs and the exurbs. Exurbs are the band of cities that are outside the suburbs. So the suburbs are connected to the central city, and the exurbs are connected to the suburbs. So that you can look at them, you know, as a kind of set of concentric rings that run out from the middle. Gentrification is the upgrading of the central part of the city as mass transit and multi-use zones and all that becomes more popular. You notice that prices in the inner cities have gone up, and there's gentrification is the rehab of those inner city areas because they're cool now to live in. And then you see the exurbs is where the corporate classers and the upper middle classers, they flee out to the exurbs to get on the 1 acre lots and the gated communities out in the exurbs. And then what was left was this kind of decline in the suburbs in the middle. And there's a lot written about the declining suburbs. And that's the sort of resegregation that we've begun to see. And now efforts by cities to try to revive the suburbs so that they don't fall into social decay. So those are the kinds of things that the social things that affect prejudice in kids and can lead to prejudice. And prejudice is the overt prejudice is not as dangerous as the subtle forms of prejudice. And these are the justified, the language that justifies prejudice. Also, it's important to make a distinction between prejudice and discrimination. And this is not often made. The term racism refers to discrimination. And that is that when a person acts in a way that exerts their power over somebody else based on race, you're depriving them of something socially. It could be safety or monetarily or anything like that. Then that's discrimination. And that's racism, sexism, ageism. That's when a person has the power to act on somebody else based on their prejudices. Prejudices can be spoken or not spoken. They can be acted on or not acted on. Prejudices can range from extremely strong determinants of a person's behavior. If a person has really strong prejudices, it's more likely to influence their behavior, to relatively mild, to the point where a person is not really even that aware of their own prejudices. So it can also range metacognitively between a high level of awareness of prejudice and a low level of awareness of prejudice. So what's valuable in some of the discussion we're having these days is that when people become more aware of their own prejudices, then they can exert control and power over their own behavior and actually act in a much less prejudicial way just by being cognitively aware of their own prejudice. So that was best described when Jesse Jackson made the comment that he was disturbed one day that he realized that when he saw a white person behind him, he had a much lower level of anxiety about that person. He felt less threatened than if a black person was behind him. And he's a black civil rights activist. So when he saw that in himself, you know, he kind of self-examined and it opened the door to him kind of gaining a deeper understanding of the nature of prejudice. And so that's why the discussions that we're having now about prejudice in the police and discrimination and the role of ethnic minorities in, is real important right now. And then finally, there's a link between how kids develop empathy and how they and how they examine or gain in the capacity to break down some of their prejudices. And that's like we talked about before, when they're developing empathy, and we prompt it by saying, well, how would you feel if you were in that person's position? We prompt them. That wasn't very nice. How would you feel if somebody did that to you? So with regard to racial discrimination or racial prejudices, or prejudices against kids for a variety of other things like being low income, the prompts like that actually help them to develop the empathy to break down some of the biases that they have, or to be much more self-aware. I saw a kid, she was 15 at the time, and this is a way above average kid, but I was standing in line and she was there with her mom, and the person waiting on him was a younger kind of person, minimum wage worker, waiting on him, and that person was kind of having difficulty and fumbling around, making mistakes, and the mom started to get frustrated, and this girl, this 15-year-old, she said, "Mom, she's only making about minimum wage, so cut her some slack." And interesting, to see a 15-year-old kid that's that insightful. And actually, that's not so completely rare, because we've seen it in other young kids when it comes to their attitudes about race, because some of the younger ones now that I run across are much more enlightened when it comes to people and their, what class they're from, and what, social class they're from, and what their race is, and things like that. They're just more in touch and self-aware, mainly because they've been in a much more diverse environment, and also because the discussion is just much more above board. So all this stuff that you see that people are kind of sick of, and all the discussion of race and all that, and people get tired of it and complain about it. But actually, if you look at it, from where we've come and where we are now, it's actually a really important conversation, and it's really good for the kids to hear this.